Hi everyone and welcome. So it's been a while since my last video. Today I wanted to talk a bit about 3D modeling, especially hard surface modeling. And this video is for all of the people that are trying to improve in, especially in hard surface modeling. But not only, not exclusively. It's a very generic tutorial, we could call it, or overview. What I wanted to go through is essentially the process of building a sci-fi modular corridor, essentially. You can see the pieces here, the ones that I've already built, and I'll put up an image of the final product, the final render, basically we could say, in Unreal Engine 5. But I'll show you the actual final result towards the end of the video. So I wanted to touch upon several different topics today, and I wanted to start from assembly. What do I mean by assembly? I mean, how are you going to build a modular part, a modular piece, essentially. Now there are many different ways you can do that. There is no set rule, but one of the let's say most efficient ways I found is to do it in pieces, essentially. So as you can see, this wall is divided into many different components. You've got a lower component and an upper component, which are exactly the same, they're just mirrored. Then you've got this second lower component, this upper component, this middle component, and then this kind of piping or tube, which is exactly in the middle. And then what you have is this rear wall, essentially, this rear piece. Now, all of these models have been built separately from each other. So I've started from this base, this rear part, and then I slowly added pieces on top. So I started by laying down the foundation, and then I said, well, I want this wall to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different parts built on it, essentially. Now I think this way is quite convenient, because this method is quite useful to use, because it allows you to deal with each model separately. So you do not have to build in topology on the base mesh and then have difficulties into modifying it. Since every component is separate, you can play around with it as much as you want, essentially. So if you don't like the topology of one, you can alter it without influencing the other models. And I think this is quite a big advantage, to be honest, if you want to do complex stuff, such as in this case. You don't have to do it. Like, if you want to keep let's say a simpler design, you don't have to necessarily separate the model into different pieces like I did, but this is just a suggestion I have. If you want to add more detail, if you want to go deeper into into detail of each model is going to be it's going to have its own topology, and ideally you want to keep it separate from the other ones. So yeah, so this is essentially the basic one of the basic steps to take before starting the modeling process, I would say. So as next topic, I want to quickly touch upon a few tips and tricks that I personally found quite useful when having to model this corridor. The first one is try to use modifiers as much as possible. For those of you who do not know what modifiers are a huge part of Blender, and they allow you to make non-permanent changes to your model. So let's take this model as an example. This is actually a really low poly model, because if I go into edit mode, you can see that actually the model is this. It's just this part. But I use the mirror modifier, So I duplicated it on the x-axis. Then what I did is I started using modifiers onto it. I started using a lot of Boolean modifiers. So for example, I added this cube. I added a bevel onto this cube. I modified it a bit. I modified the shape. And as you can see, now that I move it, using a Boolean modifier, I made a hole onto the base mesh. And then what I also did, I mirrored it in the x-axis so that I can make two holes, one on this side and one on that side. You can see that I've got it here. The same, I've done the same with this and the same with this hole essentially. So all Boolean modifiers that I applied, as you can see. And the same goes for these ones. You see? So they're great because, as I said, they allow you to make quick changes and not have them permanently onto your model. Now, obviously, when you want to export your model and you want this huge hole inside your model, you're going to have to apply the modifier. Okay? Blender usually applies it automatically when you export the model, but you can apply it before, and you can clean up topology because, as you can see here, Blender has a shitty like with these booleans, it made a shitty topology. So you're gonna have to play around a bit with some parameters here and there. For example, I think here probably we're gonna have to play around a bit with with some parameters from the beveling or of the actual boolean cubes or some other stuff to get rid of these hard edges. You can add geometry, you can remove geometry, you can move the cubes. You can do loads of different things, okay, to try and get rid of that topology. As you can see here, I managed to get rid of it. So the reason that topology that you can see here, this bad effect, light effect, is completely gone into the final model. So there are some tips and tricks around to try and avoid this. So yeah, this was one of the tips I would give. Some other tip I would give is probably texel density. So texel density, for those of you that don't know what it is, it's the it concerns textures. So texel density is the amount of pixels that your textures will cover per centimeter or meter in the game world, essentially. So obviously, the higher texel density you have, the more pixels per centimeter or per meter you're gonna have on your model. So it's gonna be more detailed, it's gonna have higher resolution. What you should try to do, you shouldn't try to strive for the highest texel density possible. No, you should try to have all your models at roughly the same texel density to have coherence between them. So to do that, I suggest you try to use a tool like Texel Density tool in Blender. It's completely free. It allows you to set a texture size, and then once you go into UV editing mode, for example, what you do is you can select after putting seams on your model, you can select your, let's say, all your model. You can do Smart UV project. You set it up as as you prefer, and then what you do is you press OK and you unwrap it. And then what you do is you can calculate your texel density here, and you can even set the texel density. So for example, I could set a texel density of 7 here and say set my texel density. And as you can see, it doesn't fit anymore into my UV space. So a texel density of 7 for my current model will not be achievable unless I use, for example, a 4K texture. Okay? Or I could use other tactics, other little tricks, such as mirroring my model, mirroring my texture. If I do that, then I will be able to achieve a 7 pixel per centimeter, because I will only be using half of the UV space that I'm using right now with the full model. But then I'm gonna have a repeated texture left and right. So you can use a lot of tricks, to achieve the desired effect. But again, my biggest suggestion is try to use the same texel density for all your models. It's really going to give coherence, to your environment. And I think a final tip for the modeling and the UV unwrapping side of things is try to make 2 models usually. a low poly one and a high poly one. The low poly one it's what's going to go into your game for performance reasons. You want to have a model that has the least amount of faces and vertices to decrease the load on your CPU and GPU essentially. You don't want them to process loads amount of useless pixels. Useless vertices and faces essentially. But then you do want the detail. You do want details on this, and to achieve those details, make a high poly model and bake a normal map. Bake the normal map of the high poly model onto your low poly model. In that way, you're gonna have all these cool effects, all these cool details that come from lighting information on your low poly model at zero cost, or at very low cost at least. Which is great, which is fantastic. It's something that you can easily do using a program such as Substance Painter. You import the low poly, and then you import the high poly, and you just say, please bake a normal map from my high poly onto my low poly. And it works usually pretty well. Sometimes you need to make a few adjustments, but it's great. I suggest you do this. So next up we've got texturing. I wanted to give you just a couple of quick tips on texturing. First of all, as I told you before, try to use a professional, or at least a good texturing software, because texturing is what makes your model look good. If you've got a really great model but you've got a crap texture in it, it's not going to look good, So you really need to try and have a software that allows you to put good textures on your models. Substance Painter is one of them, but there are loads of other ones. Now, as you can see here, I've got a low poly model, but I've got a baked normal map on it from my high poly one, which is great because this is not actual topology, this is not actual geometry, this is all coming from the normal map. But you can't really notice it unless you go super close, If you go super close, you can see these are flat faces, but if you go here, you don't really notice it. You can clearly see that these are all small holes, basically. One tip I always want to give when I talk about hard surface modeling, especially, is try to highlight your edges. Here I've overdone it, but I like it like this. This is kind of a bit my style. I like to overconsume, overdo it on the edges of my models, but I think it's pretty cool. Highlighting the edges of your models, especially if you want to make them look a bit more realistic. I think it's something really cool. Because you never have 90-degree edges in the real world. You always have either some wear on them or they're not exactly 90 degrees. So put some bevels. What I did is I put bevels on my normal map, so that already does it a bit, and then I added wear essentially on all my edges. But you don't have to put necessarily wear. You just need to put something that highlights your edges a bit. I think that's pretty cool. I think that gives a layer, an additional layer to your model. And then, if you can, try to use procedural textures like these ones. As you can see, where you've got some curvature, it added some more wear. Where you've got very, very, like hard edges, you've got even more wear. And I've got a material and a mask on it that highlights and brings up essentially the bare metal below, the unpainted metal. I think they're all little details that do make the difference in the final model, essentially. So yeah, play around a lot with your materials. Even when you've got a very basic material such as this metal, as you can see, play around with it. Put some grunge on it. Put some, make it so that it has a roughness difference. It's going to make your model so much more lively. It's going to look so much more realistic. You don't have to make them super dirty or super, you don't need to have a huge amount of wear, as I said. But there needs to be something that tells you that this is not the perfect world, This is not a simulation. It's trying to be the real world. And to be the real world, you need to try and put small imperfections into your model that come from the real world, okay? So yeah, this is my 2 cents for regarding at least texturing. So finally, I wanted to show you the end result in Unreal Engine 5. Now we're in edit mode. I just wanted to see how the whole thing was structured. So basically, what I did in Unreal 5 is I imported the several models. So I had essentially 5 models for 5 different sections for the side wall, which is repeated and it's symmetric, so it's the same on the opposite side. And then I had the ceiling and the floor. And essentially in Unreal you can do something pretty cool, which is the following. So here it's actually, you can see that the models are all separate. You can select them all essentially, but I'm just gonna quickly show you how you could potentially do it if you're using Unreal, obviously, which is not a given, but if you were, you could select all your models, and then what you can do is under Actor, Merge Actors, Merge, you would merge all of these under a single or under basically unique mesh essentially. And then you can once you have it under a single unique mesh, what you can do is you can go under Details with your unique mesh selected. You can go under Details and you can press this button, convert this actor into a reusable blueprint class, and then you can save it essentially, and you can tweak it and do whatever you want. As you can see, I have it here. I've got my section. I can repeat it wherever I want. The overkill thing about this, as you can see, is that it has loads of materials. I've got a lot of materials. I've got 25 materials on this, which is a lot of materials. But at the same time, these materials are always the same and they're repeated along the whole corridor. So I've only got 25 materials for the whole corridor basically. And actually, if you're gonna repeat the corridor throughout the game, you're gonna have only 25 materials every time you use a corridor basically. So it's always those 25 materials. So yeah, they're a lot, but they're not a huge amount at the same time. I'm gonna quickly go into play mode now, so that I can show you I've got a torchlight just to highlight the models, but so you can see that the details are really showing. The edges are quite too cool to see. You can see the wear. We've got some lights here at the top with an emission channel. Got the ceiling, and you can see that the final result, by having all these texel densities quite similar to each other, is quite coherent. I think something that I haven't mentioned, but I think it's worth mentioning, is that, as you can see, when you design and when you model a component, if in terms of from an artistic perspective at least, coherence doesn't only come from a texture point of view, but it mainly comes from the models too. So as you can see here, I really try to maintain the same motif throughout each single model. So each model has got these, let's say, round, protruding shapes, and this is something you find in each model. The lower one, this one, the middle one, the upper one. And then each model is divided in 2 different symmetric parts, basically. You see? All of them, for coherence purposes. And then each model has basically these green colors and gray metallic colors at the center and on the sides. So you see, maintaining these shapes, these coherence between the shapes, helps you have some kind of some kind of let's say repeatability factor throughout the models that allows you to yeah, have coherence throughout your design, right? So you don't have a design that is, you know, completely different at the bottom compared to the center and the top, something that does not match and is not pleasant to the eye. You need to give something to the player that when they look at your model, they're like, okay, so this flows well together. It looks like it's the same piece, it's the same structure, and every single piece is in agreement with every other piece, basically. And I think that's something to keep in mind to build good models and good environments, essentially. So, guys, thanks for watching. This was just a, you know, quick tips video. I hope I could help some of you. And if you've got any questions, just drop them below in the comments, and I'll make sure to reply. Alright, thanks, and see you in the next video.